This processor cost me $25 brand new and is relatively modern. In terms of generation, it's not the newest of the new that Intel has to offer because they're currently on 13th gen as of this video, and this is a 10th gen chip that came out in 2020. Though while not their newest offering, it's also nowhere near being obsolete. Well, kind of. I'll actually let you be the judge of that after this video. This is a Celeron processor, and it's been so long since I've actually used one of these because it's just not a class of product that's able to serve my needs nor the needs of many PC gamers out there. So there's not much reason for me to showcase them on the channel. But there is a reason why I'm holding this in my hand right now. To give you some context, not too long ago, I made a video showcasing a $300 PC using all brand new parts that was capable of gaming, featuring a Ryzen APU. Check that video if you haven't seen it yet. I'll have it in the top right card as well as in the description. That video performed decently well, and when that happens, YouTube being YouTube, the comments start rolling in. I got a comment from someone saying, APU builds don't make sense. For the same amount of money, you can build a system with a discrete card and have much better performance. Now, when I read that, I thought they were talking about a used system because with $300, you can for sure build something good with a discrete graphics card. So I responded saying, I actually built that and showed a video last week, but this I think makes for a much more interesting video for people who are not in areas with good used markets or have no experience with them. And what's the point of making the same videos with the same parts over and over versus doing something more unique and challenging? Basically, as a content creator, I can't just make a bunch of the same videos with the same parts that are the current meta. I need to change it up and explore other options to make it more interesting for the viewers. The person wrote back, I'm not talking about used parts, I'm talking about new parts. You can get a Celeron for $25, and a RX 6400 for $140. First of all, no one should be buying an RX 6400 for $140. You'd be better off buying one of those Amazon Chinese brand cut down RX 580s for cheaper. But second of all, a $25 Celeron processor, these things have 2 cores with no hyperthreading, leaving it at a total of 2 threads. Sure, it's on a relatively modern platform, it's LGA 1200 with decent clock speeds, but that's not enough. I brought this up to this person, but they insisted that the Celerons with an entry card was the better option over a Ryzen APU. Now, I normally don't tend to every comment like I did for this person, since there's usually too many for me to keep up with. But in this case, I did so because I became very curious due to that $25 price tag. I knew from the spec sheet that this Celeron would be bad for gaming, but I had not experienced it yet in person. It's one thing to form my opinion based on specs and other data I've seen online, but it's another to actually get hands-on experience playing with it and testing it. So I figured, why not? It's only $25, it doesn't cost me that much, and I already have the rest of the hardware, like the motherboard and everything else, on hand to make a quick test system. So that's exactly what I did. I picked mine up brand new from Amazon for pretty much the price the commenter quoted plus tax. I do want to note that I ordered the exact processor they said, the Intel Celeron G5920, but when I received the package, it was actually a G5925. It was kind of weird. The box was clearly a G5925 box with all the original labels and stickers, but there was a single G5920 label slapped on top of the barcode area. Honestly, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I'm not complaining. I got a slightly better product without paying more for it. The core clock on this is 100 megahertz faster, and it has double the amount of cache as the 5920. So I'm actually using a better processor than what the commenter said, giving them the advantage in the situation. Not only that, I didn't pair this with the RX 6400 like they suggested. I don't have one on hand, and I'm not going to waste money buying one of those. But what I do have on hand is an RTX 3080, which makes for a great substitution to utilize the maximum potential of the Celeron. And for memory, I decided to use 32GB of Team Group Extreme DDR4 rated at 4000 CL18. So yeah, my intent was to test the full capabilities of this little Celeron. I've given it every advantage that I could think of in terms of supporting hardware so that it could spread its wings. So let's take a look at the numbers. First up are the CPU specific benchmarks, and we'll start with Cinebench. This wasn't a great start for the Celeron because anytime I ran Cinebench, it was struggling a lot due to those 2 poor single threaded cores being fully loaded. This is actual footage of what happened during the runs. It would kind of freeze up or bug out visually and black out in parts of the screen. But it did eventually finish the run and recover the visuals when I left it alone for long enough, and here's what we're looking at for the scores. I'll be showing the Celeron results side by side to the Ryzen 5 4600G that was using that $300 all brand new parts PC. This is so that you have something to compare to, because otherwise you'd just be looking at random numbers with no real context or comparison. So in Cinebench R23, the G5925 scored just over 800 points in single core and in the mid 1600s in the multi-core. Compared to the Ryzen APU, it pretty much gets annihilated. The APU is 50% faster in single core and a whopping 454% faster in multi-core due to having 3 times as many cores and 6 times as many threads. Moving on to Blender, looking at CPU rendering, we see a similar trend. This benchmark makes use of all the cores and threads, so the performance gap is similar to Cinebench multi-core run, with the APU crushing the Celeron across all 3 scenes. In 3D Mark CPU profile, it's the same story. The Celeron single-thread performance already falls quite a bit behind, and then the multi-thread performance just gets completely demolished. It's not even a contest here. This shouldn't be surprising at all. The cheap 2-core, 2-threaded processor should be getting stomped by the more expensive 6-core, 12-threaded one. But what we just looked at were all CPU-heavy workloads, which doesn't always translate over to gaming. When gaming, the graphics card is introduced to the equation, and a lot of the time can do a lot of the heavy lifting. So let's see if that's the case with this Celeron. We'll start off with an easy to run title, League of Legends. Here the Celeron gives a playable experience with average frame rate results better than the Ryzen 5 4600G. Well, kind of. The average FPS is slightly better, which isn't too much to be proud of given that it's paired with the RTX 3080. You'd really expect it to be crushing it more than that, but the Celeron is definitely holding back the GPU. Looking at the 1% lows, the numbers are actually a little worse than the APU. Next up is Valorant, which I couldn't even get running with the G5925. Every time I tried to run it, I couldn't get past the loading screen into the main menu. The game would just crash. No matter what I did, I couldn't get it to work. I tried repairing it, running on a completely fresh Windows install, different GPU drivers, nothing. Valorant is one of the easiest games to run, so I wasn't expecting the Celeron to have issues here, so that was a bit surprising. But what we'll see in a bit here though is that this is a recurring theme with many of the other titles. Oh hey look, speaking of issues running other titles, next up is Rainbow Six Siege, which didn't work in either Vulkan or DirectX. The splash screen would run through the shader optimization, very slowly I might add, and then transition to a black screen where it hung for a bit, and then eventually got to the window spinning blue circle of death, followed by a crash message. This isn't too surprising though, because looking up the minimum system requirements for Rainbow Six Siege, it shows that they want at least a first gen i3 or a Phenom X4. While those are much older processors than the Celeron G5925, they're also 4-threaded processors, and upon doing further research, I found multiple posts about people running into the same issues when trying to run Rainbow Six Siege on 2-core, 2-thread systems. CSGO is a pretty old title. It's almost 11 years old by this point, so the Celeron is able to run it. This game is known to be more CPU dependent and shows it very apparently when you have an RTX 3080 in the system, but it's barely pulling 90 FPS. While the Celeron does beat out the Ryzen APU in average FPS, again it loses in 1% lows. It's still playable, but really shows how limiting the Celeron is, even when paired with a great GPU and RAM. Moving on, we have Apex Legends, which surprisingly the Celeron was able to run. Here it easily beats the APU because of the raw power of the RTX 3080. This is one of the titles where the GPU can do a lot of the heavy lifting, and it was able to provide a stutter-free experience with playable 1% lows. The Ryzen APU integrated graphics is definitely struggling here. Do note though that the results that you're seeing is in arena matches, which occurs on smaller maps, so the Celeron has a little bit more room to breathe. As soon as we take it to the bigger Battle Royale map though, that's not the case anymore, and the Celeron runs at a constant full 100% load on both cores, and it makes for a very stuttery experience, dipping into the single-digit FPS, making it practically unplayable. Fortnite is next, which I could already tell from the start was gonna have issues. Just sitting in the main menu, the Celeron was already struggling, running at 100% load on both cores. It couldn't be played on DX11 or DX12. Whenever I tried, the loading screen would just freeze and the game would crash. So I was forced to play in performance mode, which did successfully load a match. Fortnite was completely unplayable. The frame rate was constantly dipping, and it was riddled with moments where it would freeze for literally a second or two, as you can see shown here. This is not something you want happening in crucial moments like in the middle of a gunfight. It was bad. The Ryzen APU on the other hand handled Fortnite in performance mode just fine. It got really good numbers and just hands down beat the Celeron. In Forza Horizon 5, the Celeron was met with this compatibility warning, stating that it was not a supported CPU. The minimum specs for Forza Horizon 5 is at least a Core i5-4460 or a Ryzen 3 1200, both which are 4-core 4-thread processors. But screw it, I ignored the warning and the game actually loaded up just fine. We weren't completely in the clear though, because while the benchmark was able to start and run problem-free for a little bit, it completely froze about 45 seconds into the race. I tried to repeat the test several times with the same end result each time. I guess I should have listened to that compatibility message after all. Halo Infinite is next, and the loading screen did not give me much hope. Here's the Celeron struggling to load into the main menu, both cores going at full throttle and stuttering the entire way, as you can see on the screen right now. Once we got through that painfully slow process, the menus were bugging out and freezing constantly. I was just about ready to call it quits right there, but I decided to give it a little bit more time, and to my surprise, the Celeron was actually able to load into a match. Unfortunately, once it was in the match, it was pretty unplayable. While it did get really good average FPS, the 1% lows were single digit, which was very noticeable for a fast-paced FPS like this. The Ryzen APU, on the other hand, had to be run at a lower resolution because Halo is a very modern game that is graphics intensive. But even then, it was still a much better playing experience than the Celeron because of that 1% low being above 30 FPS. And by the way, for those of you who may be wondering, I did try frame capping during these benchmarks to see if it alleviated the load on the CPU at all, but it did not. Here's Halo running with a 60 FPS cap, and as you can see, the 1% lows are still pretty bad in the single digits. The new Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 couldn't even get past the Steam play button. I'd press play, the button changes for a split second, and then goes back to as if it was never pressed at all. No error or crash message or anything, it just refused to work. This actually has a surprisingly low barrier to entry. The minimum system specs call for something as old as an i5-2500K, which you'd think isn't asking for much, but even so, the Celeron just isn't up to par. On the flip side, the Ryzen APU had to play at 720p at minimum settings, but hey, at least it was able to play it, and the average and 1% low results were decent. Elden Ring was a similar story. It took forever to get past the anti-cheat splash screen, only to be met with a forever white screen of unplayableness. I can't say that's too surprising though, considering the minimum specs for this game are actually the most demanding of any title I tested. And last but not least, Cyberpunk. I like to throw Cyberpunk at lower end hardware just because it's kind of fun to see. I go in with low expectations, and sometimes I am pleasantly surprised. Well, the first surprise here for me is that the game actually loaded into the menus without any errors or crashing on the Celeron. But unfortunately, that's about where the surprises end, because as soon as I tried loading into the game, I was met with an infinite black screen of nothingness. I gave it 10 minutes, nothing changed, it never finished loading, so this was a bust. Minimum specs for Cyberpunk? Oddly enough, older hardware than some of the other titles that we saw earlier, both from 2012. You can crap on APUs all you want, but the 4600G is the real G here, because it could even run Cyberpunk at all on integrated graphics. Sure, it was with the help of FSR and at the bare minimum graphic settings, but hey, it was playing it and it wasn't really stuttering either. So there you have it, the Celeron G5925. What do you think? I have mixed feelings because at the end of the day, this was a $25 processor. I didn't have high expectations for it, so it's not like I was let down. I tried to keep an open mind and took everything into consideration when using the Celeron, and no matter what, my conclusion comes out the same. This thing sucks. I don't think anyone should ever buy this. Not for gaming, not for office work, not for general internet browsing and media consumption. You start to even think about multitasking with this, and it will instantly start feeling super sluggish. Just updating and patching games alone pegged it at 100%, making basic tasks like opening up a single browser tab or file explorer feel noticeably slower. Processors from 10 years ago run circles around this thing. And by the way, I am by no means trying to push APUs and integrated graphics onto people. I know that some of you out there hate the idea of integrated graphics, which is fine. If you can afford a discrete graphics card, that is by far the better solution, and you should go for it. Just don't go pairing a Celeron with it in order to come within budget. There still needs to be some balance between the CPU and the GPU. But yeah, before we wrap this up though, I want to ask you all a hypothetical question based on what you just saw in this video. If you had to be stuck with one of two systems for an entire year and you couldn't use any other PC during that time, which would you choose? System 1 will be a Ryzen 5 4600G APU build with everything else standard, 16 gigs of RAM, 1TB SSD, quality power supply, case, etc. And the second system is one with the Celeron G5925 with the RTX 3080 in it, same everything else, same RAM, SSD, quality PSU, case. Which would you choose to exclusively use for an entire year? You cannot use any other system. You have to use one of these two. And no, you do not get to keep the system after the year's up. These systems are for borrow that you have to use exclusively and then return. Don't try to game the question. I know how some of you guys think. You're like me and you choose a system with the RTX 3080 just because at the end of it, you think you could keep it and sell it or just have a way better card. No, that is not one of the options. You are giving it back afterwards. But for me personally, I'm going with the APU system because it could actually play every game thrown at it. Sure, it's not the best graphic settings, but being able to play a game at low settings at consistent frame rates is still infinitely better than not being able to play the game at all, which is the case of this with so many titles out there. Plus, the APU system can do everything else way better than this, like Photoshop, Premiere Pro, PowerPoint spreadsheets, navigating through just the basic Windows OS and File Explorer. Yeah, it can do all of that way better than this Celeron, which feels so slow. But that's me. Which system would you choose? I'm very curious to hear what y'all choose. Let me know down in the comments below. This is going to be a fun one. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this video though. Hope you all enjoyed and found this either entertaining or helpful in one way or another. I want to thank you all as always for watching and for continuing to support the channel. Thanks to all the channel members for their above and beyond support. Be safe out there, and I'll see y'all down in the comments as well as in the next stream and or video. Bye.